All right. Let's do this.
My 5 minutes of fame is forever.
Good evening, everyone. It's good to see you all here. I see many, obviously, familiar faces. We've got a nice, intimate crew tonight. This is good. This will be fun. This hopefully means lots of interaction and interrupting Devin. Oops, sorry. I spoiled who's speaking. I'm going to get to that in a moment. Glad you're all here. I know this is is this week 6? This is week 6, right? Yeah, week 6. You're officially in the plateau, the first plateau of the semester, where you have to kind of get past the hump, and then it just keeps going. But that's it. You didn't hear that from me. No, we're excited for tonight. We have some very exotic guest speakers that we pulled in from. We used all of our club funds actually to get them in country, in state. It was quite the ordeal. I have to read their credentials here. It's a very. Let me just scroll through a bunch of them. Okay, so it actually looks like the only one they wrote down was current and temporary students. So whatever that means, it means you can probably listen to them. But no, and all jokes aside, we are very excited to have Devin and Julia presenting tonight. It's really cool to have students, like people our age in our world, presenting on these things. I think it's good for us to remember that these topics are not things that are only attainable if you have 3 PhDs and you study them for 4 years, right? Although Devin and Julia are both that smart, of course. But yeah, this is stuff that we can know and explain and teach and discuss. And so we're always very excited to have students and especially Rational Christie leaders presenting it. So I'm gonna pray them in and then I'm gonna stop talking and I'm gonna let you guys take it from there. So please bow your heads, I'm gonna pray. Lord, thank you for this evening. Thank you for this group, each person that you have brought through these doors. We know it's intentional. Thank you for Devin and Julia and their consistency at supporting this club, supporting the people here, the friendships that they've made, just what you've done through them. We pray that you would continue to work through them this evening, be with them during it, give them a calmness, peace, give them a clarity on what they are saying, help them to focus on the value of what they're communicating, and may we all benefit from them. May we listen well and attentively, and may you teach us through them this evening. So in your name we pray all these things. Amen. All right, all yours.
Howdy, y'all. Can you tell I'm from Texas? Well, if it isn't obvious, we're talking about the Kalam Cosmological argument. Woo! Really exciting, I know. Well, yeah, so to get started, we wanted to actually show you a video of somebody else talking about it.
That's a good start.
Because William Lane Craig is a very knowledgeable person in this argument. He's one of the main guys that has been recently talking about it and continuing to develop it. So we wanted to have him talk on it a little bit because he's gonna say a lot of words that are gonna be slightly confusing. But we just wanna let you guys hear it a few times because this is a very dense argument. So we want to make sure that you guys can hear it a few times so you can really understand what
From different ways of explaining it too.
Yes.
Sometimes a different one will hit better.
So, without further ado, Mike Craig. Hopefully sound works.
The origin of the universe. Have you ever asked yourself where the universe came from? Was there a beginning to the universe? Or does it just go back and back forever? Typically, naturalists have said that the universe is just eternal and uncaused, and that's all. But there are good reasons, both philosophical and scientific, to doubt that this is the case. Philosophically, the idea of an infinite past is very problematic. Think about it. If the universe never had a beginning, that means that the number of past events in the history of the universe is infinite. But the existence of an actually infinite number of things leads to metaphysical absurdities. To give one example, what is infinity minus infinity? Well, mathematically, you get self-contradictory answers. For example, if you had an infinite number of coins, numbered 1, 2, 3, and so on, to infinity, and I took away all the odd-numbered coins, how many coins would you have left? Well, you'd still have all the even numbered coins, right? Or an infinity of coins. So infinity minus infinity is infinity. But now suppose instead that I took away all of the coins numbered greater than 3. Now how many coins would you have left? Well, just 3. So infinity minus infinity is 3. And yet in each case, I took away an identical number of coins from an identical number of coins and came up with contradictory results. In fact, you can get any answer when you subtract infinity, from 0 to infinity. And for that reason, inverse operations like subtraction and division are simply prohibited in transfinite arithmetic. But that convention doesn't apply to the real world. You can give away whatever coins you want. This shows, I think, that infinity is just a concept or an idea in your mind, not something that exists in reality. David Hilbert, who was perhaps the greatest mathematician of the 20th century, states, and I quote, "The infinite is nowhere to be found in reality. It neither exists in nature nor provides a legitimate basis for rational thought. The role that remains for the infinite to play is solely that of an idea." But that entails that since past events are not just ideas in your mind, but are real, the number of past events must be finite. Therefore, the series of past events can't go back and back forever. Rather, the universe must have begun to exist. This purely philosophical conclusion has been confirmed by remarkable discoveries in astronomy and astrophysics. In one of the most startling developments of modern science, we now have pretty strong evidence that the universe is not eternal in the past, but had an absolute beginning a finite time ago. For all matter and energy, even physical space and time themselves, came into being at a point in the finite past. As the physicist P.C.W. Davies says, the coming into being of the universe, as discussed in modern science, is not just a matter of imposing some sort of organization upon a previous incoherent state, but literally the coming into being of all physical things from nothing. Now, of course, alternative theories have been proposed over the years to try to avoid this absolute beginning. But none of these theories has commended itself to the majority of the scientific community. In fact, in the year 2003, 3 cosmologists, Arvin Bord, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin, were able to prove that any universe, which is on average in a state of cosmic expansion throughout its history, cannot be eternal in the past, but must have a past space-time boundary. This theorem applies not only to the standard model, but also to semi-classical quantum gravity models, inflationary models of the universe, and higher dimensional brane cosmologies. Vilenkin pulls no punches. He writes, "It is said that an argument is what convinces reasonable men, and a proof is what it takes to convince even an unreasonable man. With the proof now in place," he says, "cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning," end quote. That problem was nicely captured by Anthony Kenny of Oxford University when he wrote, "A proponent of the Big Bang Theory, at least if he is an atheist, must believe that the universe came from nothing and by nothing." But surely that doesn't make sense. For such a conclusion is, in the words of the philosopher of science Bernhard Königsscheider, in head-on collision with the most successful ontological commitment in the history of science, namely the metaphysical principle that out of nothing, nothing comes. So, why does the universe exist instead of just Nothing. Where did it come from? There must have been a cause which brought the universe into being. We can summarize the argument thus far as follows. Premise 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause. 2, the universe began to exist. 3, therefore, the universe has a cause. Given the truth of the two premises, the conclusion necessarily follows. Now, what sort of cause is this? Well, from the very nature of the case, this cause must be an uncaused, changeless, timeless, and immaterial being which created the universe. It must be uncaused because we've seen there cannot be an infinite regress of causes. So we must come to an absolutely first, uncaused cause. It must be timeless and therefore changeless, at least without the universe, because it created time. Because it also created space, it must transcend space as well, and therefore be immaterial, not physical. Moreover, I would argue this cause must also plausibly be personal. For ask yourself, how else could a timeless cause give rise to a temporal effect with a beginning, like the universe? If the cause were just a mechanically operating set of necessary and sufficient conditions, then the cause could never exist without its effect. Once the sufficient conditions are given, then the effect must be given as well. For example, suppose the cause of water's freezing is the temperatures being below 0 degrees centigrade. If the temperature were below 0 degrees from eternity past, then any water that was around would be frozen from eternity. It would be impossible for the water just to begin to freeze a finite time ago. So if the cause is permanently present, its effect must be permanently present as well. The only way for the cause to be timeless and for its effect to begin a finite time ago is for the cause to be a personal agent endowed with freedom of the will, and who therefore has the ability to spontaneously create a new effect without any antecedent determining conditions. For example, a man who has been sitting from eternity could freely will to stand up, and thus we would have an effect with a beginning arise from an eternal cause. And thus we're brought not merely to a transcendent cause of the universe, but to its personal creator.
Alright, well now that you've heard somebody with like 30 million PhDs explain it, now you get to hear two college students explain it, so congratulations.
So I'm just gonna take you through the argument structure one more time. This will not be the last time. So whatever begins to exist has a cause of its existence. That's fairly straightforward. So the second premise is that the universe began to exist. There are more subpoints under this. So based on the impossibility of an actual infinite, we'll go into what that means and why an actual infinite cannot exist. And then you cannot form one by any way we can conceive. And there's more to that as well. And so therefore the conclusion. I'll let this sit up there if you want to read it, take a picture, write it down, stare at it upside down. Whatever you want to do with it. Because, again, this is a lot of words and it's very dense. So do what you need to. I still see some phones. All right. So number one. Have you ever seen anything happen without a cause? Has anyone ever seen it? Like this ball is about to hit this one and then it's gonna cause things. Everything in physics, there's like, you have a physics problem. Well, a ball's rolling downhill, what caused that, etc. So in general, not just in general, always, things have to have a cause. So that's the first premise. The second premise is, what is an actual infinite? and this is something I love going more into. So you remember Dr. Hansberger, who came here. I wrote a paper about this in his class, and I went very much into math, and he's not a math person. He's like, of course you're going to mines. You went so much into math. So this is really fun stuff to me. So it's not a potential infinite, but an actual infinite. So a potential infinite is like this asymptote where so many other things we use in math to define things or run into limits or whatever, there can actually be very useful in controls, mostly for finding limits because they do break your calculators, but still a thing we can use in math. Is a concept, there's no problems with the concept existing in the realm of math. Like anything over 0 will get you infinity. That's a potential infinite, it's theoretical. An actual infinite is a collection of items in reality that is like a truly infinite number of objects. So not just going off into infinity like the ends of the axes, but just an actual infinite number of moments in the past, or infinite number of coins, or hotel rooms, or whatever your example is, that's not actually physically possible. So you can't sum without using the actual value of infinity itself, which is its own value. And you can't, like if you subtract 3 from infinity, you still have infinity. And same thing with, yeah, either way. So the value of infinity itself is theoretically the only thing that can change infinity. If you, like, as Craig pointed out, but that's not even always consistent. This is only valid argument for potential infinites. None of this makes any sense for actual. Yeah.
Is there the need, is it necessary to have an actual infinite?
For an infinite universe, like, you mean for, like, if the universe always existed versus it had a beginning?
Yeah, do we actually have need of this actual infinite?
So each moment in time is like an object almost. And so if that spanned back into nothingness, there would be moments of time going back into infinity. And so those, because they're not theoretical math terms, they're actual things that happened, that would be needing an actual infinite, and that's the problem with that.
We don't have one?
Yeah.
Okay, I understand.
And yes, answer or ask questions throughout. We don't mind that. So again, can you add to infinity or count backwards conversely? When would you start? When did you start? If you're counting down from infinity, you would have already ended, but you'd also still be counting at the same time. And same thing, if you were to count up to infinity, why didn't you start yesterday? You should have. So it's nonsensical. You're never going to get there. And so that's one of the arguments, that you can never actually count. Even if you count by 3s, you're still going to be counting forever. And it doesn't make sense even if you can count backwards, because you would run into the same problem. Because you never would have started and also never would have stopped. So therefore, the universe had a cause of its existence. That's the whole argument. Again. But there's more.
So we have Sobel's response. He was contradictory to the Kalam cosmological argument and brings up multiple points to try and contradict or discount the argument itself. He actually agrees with the first premise, but he gives a little fishhook in there. He says only if the phrase begins to exist means exists after some time in the past, at and before which no sensible thing existed. And if you read that and have some questions on ideas of where he might be going, then you're probably right. He does dispute the second premise on the grounds that the universe did not begin to exist, because he claims that with his new definition, that the universe didn't actually begin to exist. That there was a time where no sensible things existed before it, or that there wasn't a time that no sensible things existed before it. Therefore, it was always here. But my big question that I always ask is, what does he mean by sensible thing to exist? Because we could almost arbitrarily pick any single point in time if we felt like it to say that something sensible has begun to exist. We could argue for the fact that once humanity started doing things, that was a sensible time for things to exist. But for the sake of Sobel's argument, we will give the idea that the sensible time for things to exist is whenever the universe was supposedly created. In his main arguments, he brings up the idea that the universe is infinite, and that can bring up a lot of problems, as Craig already mentioned, as Julia already partially mentioned, such as Hilbert's paradox of the Grand Hotel. This is one of the more prominent ones that I'm sure some people have heard about, but the paradox goes as follows, where there's this hotel that has infinite number of rooms. It is a physical hotel with an infinite number of rooms. They then take on an infinite number of people to fill all those infinite rooms in the hotel. So the clerk at the front desk can confidently say that every single room is full. There is no more room in the hotel because you have an infinite number of people and an infinite number of rooms. But somebody walks up to the clerk and says, I would like to get a room here, please. And he says, well, the rooms are full. It's like, well, can't you just move people? He's like, oh yeah, sure, we can do that for you. So he starts moving people. They start moving. The first person in the first room moves to the second place. The second person moves to the third room, so on and so forth. And suddenly, now there is room. Because you've just added one person to this infinite number of people. And now there's still an infinite number of rooms with an infinite number of people with no room. However, you just added somebody. That doesn't particularly make sense to me, and there's plenty of arguments that are similar to this. One of my favorites that I saw was Gabriel's horn. It is a geometric shape that has a infinite surface area, but a very finite volume. It essentially uses the idea of limits, and I mean, similar on Julia's slide, that it infinitely approaches zero. Well, you have a surface like that, it converges to a specific number, per se. So if you were to revolve that into a horn shape, you could reasonably have a converging volume. But if you were to try and take the surface area of that thing, it would be infinite. There is no end to that limit. It will endlessly approach zero, which just doesn't really make sense. And please, if you want to and take a picture of this and go over all of them, please, I find them pretty interesting to read. Some of them are pretty hard to read, but more power to you if you decide to anyway.
Specifically, it doesn't make sense for it to exist in real life.
Yes.
Because like we can conceptualize these things, and personally it is fun little brain teasers to do, but actually making a Gabriel's horn is not gonna happen. And so again, they're examples of potential infinites, not actual infinites. So Groothuis is another response. So he lists objections, just a couple that I'm going to mention are from Russell and Kant. He defends the general cosmological arguments, because this is not the only one, this is just the one we're going over. And then also the scientific confirmation of the Big Bang, along with other things, but those are the things I picked out for this. The reason I have the cover of the book is because I grew up seeing it on my mom's bookshelf and on the table, everywhere around the house, and I didn't know what it was until I started coming to Ratio Christi, and we had Groothuis speak here, and I'm like, oh!
That's how you pronounce her name?
In any case. So I read this chapter over Christmas break, his chapter about this, because I had it in the house. So Russell's response is that if the premise one is true, then God must also have the cause, which is a reasonable thing to say if you haven't thought through it, but God is self-existent, as we'll explain more later, but he has to be, because if the universe had a cause to the beginning, there had to be a cause for that. We only are claiming that the universe began to exist and everything that begins to exist had to have a cause. We are not saying that God began to exist because he's self-existent. These are just a couple of Bible verses where Jesus says it, where it's said about him. So I recommend looking at those. In Kant's response, he says, since the ontological argument fails, so does the Kalam cosmological argument. Let me explain the ontological argument a little bit. It's basically saying, like, God is a being that which no greater thing can exist or be conceived. And so, necessarily, God must exist. Because a God that exists, there's nothing greater than, if you're only imagining it, one that exists in real life is a greater being than just one in your head. And so logically, it has to exist. We've had a whole talk about this. I just wanted to explain it a little bit for the sake of this. The difference it is from the cosmological argument is they're making different claims about God. The cosmological argument is claiming that God is self-existent and therefore factually necessary to cause the universe. Like I said, self-existent, he did not need his own cause because he never began to exist, but he is factually necessary for the universe to exist. The ontological argument is claiming that he's the greatest thing conceived and he's logically necessary because of that. Logically necessary and factually necessary are different concepts. Both of these are possible taken together, but you do not need to, one does not depend on the other. Now we happen to believe both, but just because one supposedly fails according to Kant does not disprove the other. More objections to premise one is that some say subatomic particles pop into existence out of nothing. So why not the entire universe, especially at the beginning? So John Jefferson Davis has a response. It's like, yes, we do not understand quantum physics, and it's not all classical, as I learned a little bit in PChem and got bogged down, and I'm glad I'm done with that class. But that doesn't mean it's unpredictable. We can write equations for them, even if it's weird even. But they're with order, and we're discovering more about quantum physics as we go. And additionally, uranium decays into lead, not other things. It doesn't go backwards. Decay is always in the direction it's going. So you're not going to have things like combining together and forming new elements without intelligent causes making that happen. Obviously, scientists are developing new elements all the time. I'm hearing of some new exciting ones, but that needs a designer. And so, like I said, there are laws of some kind in the quantum realm, and we definitely don't understand them all. But thankfully, God does understand them. He can see them. He's always understood them. He made them. So the universe follows the same quantum rules. And so I would not say that the whole universe popped into existence. Grace.
Couldn't you also say that like a quantum field counts as a something and not a nothing?
Yeah. Yes, yes you can. And so I was doing some reading on that like initially, and it says that in the nothingness before the Big Bang, the quantum laws like did it change or something, and that caused the Big Bang. But how, if there's nothing to begin with, how would changing a law change anything? And what changed the law is the other question. So it didn't really solve the problem for me. It was an interesting little thought that article had. I think that honestly was in high school when I was researching that, so I don't remember the source. So more defense of Grooteye's premise 2. So God existed before creation, before time. John 17 says that. And God's infinity is qualitative, not quantitative. We do not have to count God's infinity. He has infinite love, infinite power, infinite presence, all of these things. We don't need to count that for that to be real, which I'm thankful for. We do not, as humans, need to imagine all of God's parts for him to be real, because that's just who God is. And so it's more of a qualitative, not quantitative. And as a song that many of us know, when we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, We've no less days to sing God's praise than when we first began. It's a very artistic rendering of what infinity will be, because we can go we can make that number however big we want, and it still does not change how much time we have. And so I especially like that illustration of it. So he also defends the Big Bang by saying, pointing out that the universe is in fact expanding and getting faster, which leads to, it's evidence that there was an initial explosion and outburst of energy. And we can see a radiation heat map around the universe based on various imaging we have. And also pointing out hydrogen is used up and not resupplied. We can't get more, the universe will not make more. Protons are not being made. So, at least from my understanding, so it's we have to keep that in mind. So that implies the beginning. And also entropy is my favorite part of thermodynamics. Every time I took a thermo class, which was many of them, I just loved learning about entropy, because for me, I just look at it and go, okay, so the Big Bang is this enormous reversal of entropy. How did that just happen without an outside thing? Because we can't reverse entropy without an external cause. Actually, one of my favorite examples are these little heat packs. I press this button and it heats up. And that is I believe that means it's reversing entropy. I haven't thought too much about it, but then I have to boil it to reset it. In any case, this is taking external force to do its thing. It's not just gonna do it without me. And so the universe isn't going to just order itself into organisms and plants and DNA and worlds and all these without something making that happen.
And now we will be getting to 10 top ridiculous objections to the Kalam cosmological. So, don't worry, there's more. But we're gonna go over these. These are titled Ridiculous because this is based on a talk that William Lane Craig did. I encourage you to watch it if you want even more information on it. But I thought it would be valuable to talk on these because a lot of these are going to be a lot more grounded in reality. I'm not telling you that philosophers aren't grounded in reality, but they use a lot of big words. And most people aren't going to be using those. They're more likely to ask you seemingly dumb questions about these arguments. And if you're not a philosopher super familiar with all these terms and everything like that, that can be really hard to talk about. That can be really hard to combat because they could say something that maybe you weren't prepared for, or maybe you never thought of. So these 10, while ridiculous, are very valuable because they will probably more likely than not something that you will hear if you were to bring up this argument with somebody. So starting off with one. Craig only believes the Kalam cosmological argument because of the Holy Spirit in it. This can be applied to you if you're talking about it to somebody. This can be applied to anyone who's bringing up this argument. But that is a very, very basic example of an ad hominem argument. In summary, an ad hominem argument. Yes, Grant?
Doesn't that kind of just, if I'm reading this right, doesn't that just kind of hand over the whole, isn't the whole idea to prove the existence of God, and if you're he only believes in God because God is in him.
Yeah.
I don't know. Has anybody actually made that argument?
Craig has experienced that argument quite a lot, apparently, because he decided to make an entire video on it. So, but yes, an ad hominem argument being an attack on somebody's character. So, discounting somebody's point or argument or something by discounting their character. This is not as much of a traditional example of it as most people immediately imagine. You're stupid, therefore you're wrong. But they're still basing they're basing his argument on his character and his already belief in God, which logically doesn't make sense. If I believe that if I throw something at the floor it'll break, that isn't based on my character whether it will break or not, it is based on the actual action or the logic behind it. Yes.
I think that the one like you might hear more common is because you believe in God or because you're a Christian, and that's the same approach. I guess it's just phrased differently than this. I don't think, Grant, somebody's like likely to accuse you of, well, you have the Holy Spirit, that is why you're doing this, unless it's like a demon. But I think a Christian argument maybe is more common.
Yeah. But yeah. So most common, like Coach said, it would not be uncommon for somebody to ask you whether you just believe this argument simply because you're Christian, which is something that can be brought up quite often. And an example I like to put is, or an example of where it might be actually applicable with an ad hominem argument, is where somebody's character or belief actually does affect the outcome, such as whether you should believe a thief or not. If the thief tells you they just stole all your stuff and they say, believe me, I am not to be inclined to believe him. That wouldn't, me telling him that I am not going to believe him, because that would not be an ad hominem argument simply because of the circumstance of it. But specifically with arguments, especially based on logic, it doesn't make sense to attack the person if the logic is sound and expect the argument to crumble. A second point that is brought up is
I did want to mention there's a difference between what you believe and what's actually true. You can believe the thief that he didn't steal your stuff, but he very clearly did.
Yes, a very fair point.
What would be your comeback to number one? Someone said, well, you just believe that because you're a Christian. And you would say,
I would definitely just go to the point of that the argument is based on logic, not my belief. Purely the argument itself is not based on my belief or Craig's belief or whoever wrote it however many hundreds or thousands of years ago. The argument is not necessarily based on my belief.
I will,
so, go ahead.
I'll point out that the Kalam argument was actually written by a Muslim many centuries ago. That's why it has its name. This is an argument appropriate for deistic belief, not necessarily just Christian, but Jews, Muslims, and Christians can all use this argument to argue for their worldview. So that's not even necessarily the Holy Spirit, or I believe this because of my faith in my God. It's more of a logic-based argument that can be a little more generalized in theistic belief.
Well, just remember, I guess the first thing to do is say, please tell me what the problem is with the argument. Is it premise one? Is it premise two? Does the conclusion somehow not follow from those two premises? Tell me about that. So that's one thing to do. The other thing is, remember what the conclusion is. Is the conclusion that God exists? No, what's the conclusion?
The universe began to exist.
That's it.
It had a cause.
Had a cause of existence. Yeah.
Okay. The universe had a cause. That's the conclusion. Now, in the video, Craig goes on to say, is there anything we can say about that cause? Now, and then tell me why I'm not wrong in those inferences. But you have to push back on that and say, you show me where the logic fails.
The statement ad hominem, it means against the person. So you got the person here, you may not like the shirt he has on, you're like Texas or something. But he's not dealing with the argument itself. It's one thing to attack the person, it's another. So that's why Carl's saying, tell me what's wrong with the argument. So,
And second point, truth of the premise presupposes the truth of the conclusion. This is also most often known as question begging. It's pretty hard to explain, so I'm going to give you an example of the improved Kalam argument. Either the Christian God is real, or I am wearing a feather hat. I am not wearing a feather hat. Therefore, God is real. This makes absolutely zero sense. If I were to bring this up to literally anyone, I have serious doubts that this would do anything to convince him. And that is because I'm begging the question. In the first point, I am pretty much explicitly saying that the Christian God is real. I'm not basing my argument on logic or using a series of steps to get to this point. I'm starting with that the Christian God is real. Because obviously, I am not wearing a feather hat. But that is not an argument for saying that the Christian God is real. The actual Kalam argument doesn't do this. In the first premise, there is absolutely zero mention of God. It is not presupposing the idea that God is existing. It doesn't say that God exists and the universe started to begin or anything like that. It simply says that created things have to have a cause. Things that begin have to have a cause. It does not mention or beg the question, per se, of the existence of God. So this is something that very much could pop up because it is very easy for people, like mentioned, that the Kalam cosmological argument does not actually lead to God specifically, Christian God or any God specifically. It simply leads to a cause or an uncaused causer by some steps. So there is no actual step to God, and it is very common for people to make that mistake when making this type of argument. 3. The fallacy of equivocation on the use of the word cause. So, Craig uses the word cause quite a few times in his argument, and there are 2 different types of causes that Craig most often mentions in his works or in other works, or that he talks about in general. One being an efficient cause, and the other being a material cause. As an example, a material cause for, let's say, a statue would be the actual marble that it is made out of. It is the physical things that cause the thing to come into being, such as, for other examples, is just, if you've ever made anything, you had to get some sort of material. That would be the material cause. That would be the physical thing that is used to make whatever is being caused. An efficient cause would be the maker. So for the marble statue, it would be the person who carved the marble statue. For making something, it would be all of you. If you've ever made something, you are the efficient cause of that thing. The fallacy of equivocation that they're calling is on the first 2 points. They're saying the fact that he is using efficient cause in his final statement and material cause in his first statement. For the first statement, they're saying that everything must have a material cause. That is what they're claiming of his argument. And then, as in the last point, they're saying he is actually meaning efficient cause. He is not, in fact, doing this. He mentions it explicitly that he is talking about efficient causes. He is not talking about the physical things that are causing them, but instead he's talking about the thing or person or being that actually caused the materials to be made, in a weird way of saying it. Next is another fallacy, the fallacy of composition. Just because everything in the universe has a cause does not mean that the universe itself has a cause. An example, just to explain the fallacy of composition, is the idea of Legos. You were building something with Legos. The fallacy of composition would apply if I were to assume that I start making Legos, start building them up, and then once I'm done with my Lego set, they suddenly turn into metal. That doesn't quite make sense, because the building blocks themselves begin as plastic, and once I'm finished, it is still plastic. Another example of this would be an elephant. If I were to look at a small piece of an elephant, like just something I could very lightly carry in my hand, I would say, this is pretty light. If I were to assume the idea that the entire elephant is light because I am holding this small piece of the elephant and saying, this is very light, that would be falling into the fallacy of composition. The individual pieces do not necessarily speak to the entirety of the object. The argument itself actually does not claim anything about composition. The argument in the 3 points does not claim that because things are caused in the universe within it, such as, me falling over or something caused by me catching my leg on something. It does not claim that there is anything in the universe that is causing or that is being equivocated to the actual cause overall of the universe. He does use examples. A lot of the examples and a lot of the paradoxes that I showed you are could, I guess in theory, fall into the fallacy of composition. But those examples are examples. They're not meant to be the basis of the argument. They're simply there to express the absurdity of having an absolute or actual infinite within reality.
Well, but so there's where you have to be careful here. First you say, well, I agree with your statement, okay? But that's not what the argument says. It points out that everything that begins to exist has a cause, and then it's not saying, and because of that, the universe began to exist. No, it points to the fact that the universe did begin to exist. That's a scientific fact. And then we draw a conclusion, it had a cause. So they're kind of tripping you up with language in effect, but they're way off base if you get this kind of complaint.
And as we showed in the first slide with the actual argument, the second premise, which is often one of the most disputed ones, is not just simply a statement that you just have to oh yeah, I just said that and you have to believe it because I said so. There was a list of reasons of why we should believe that thing. We are not trying to belittle that argument by using examples that could be falling into the fallacy of composition. So now, an experiment.
Is this repeatable?
Is there a beginning?
There are no constraints on that. So nothing itself can do anything, including create universes. Well, I was hoping that nothing would intervene and switch the slide for me, but it appears that nothing has happened. So, talking on this in actuality, the idea that nothing itself can do anything, including create universes, contradicts the idea of nothing. If you're saying nothing is doing something, then something is there. You can't say that nothing has caused me to fall. No, you got your leg caught somewhere, which caused you to fall. And I have a feeling I know what this is going to look like, but who has taken physics? Woo! Yeah, pretty much everyone. We see examples of this in physics where they say conservation of mass, conservation of energy. Things don't just appear. It's not like nothing has caused something to appear. It doesn't make logical sense. And of course, approaching this, if someone were to bring this up, don't call them stupid.
Well,
There's, as much as you would like to do that, do not. There is a lot of things that you should do, that is not one of them. But taking a loving and caring approach to it and maybe asking them what they mean by nothing. What do you mean by nothing causing something? How would you suppose that it would create a universe? Like what do you think that would look like? But asking questions like that and trying to get them to think about it is a very good thing to do, because more often than not, the reason why they bring up these types of things is that they didn't think about it. So if you were to bring it up and try and get them to really think about why they're saying what they're saying, that more often can have the person realize what they are either trying to say or what they maybe mistakenly said. Whatever it may be, just asking questions is never a bad thing in almost any of these examples.
So in Hawking's last word, he said something to the effect of, because there is such a thing as the law of gravity, the universe can spring out of nothing. Well, that sounds like this. The problem is, what Hawking meant by nothing was not actually nothing. So who was asking about fields? Is that Grayson? So his nothing was not actually nothing. It was fields was what he was thinking of, and not actually nothing. But when we're thinking about Big Bang cosmology, we really mean nothing at time zero.
Also, didn't he say that you have to have two particles that are somehow opposite each other spring into existence on opposite sides of the event horizon? And one falls into the singularity, and then the other, now you've got a particle that just appeared out of nothing.
Yeah.
Isn't that how it goes?
Yeah, but there's something though.
Yeah, there was something.
There's still something, that nothing is not nothing.
Right.
Is there a logical problem with fields existing without matter or energy existing?
What's a field then?
I don't
If it's
know.
not matter or energy.
That's the question. What does it feel?
But like, is there a problem with saying that there might have been something before?
Well, what's that something made of?
Well, I don't know.
Aren't those fields made out of energy? I'm fuzzy on this, but.
I don't know.
If you're asking, like, I think they'd say it is illogical, but I think specifically in Dawkins' wording, he says with a law such as gravity. So I think he's arguing that it's the laws that exist,
Yeah.
that he says it's not even like they can bring a universe. He says by necessity, basically, they will always like create a universe. And I like John Lennox has an answer, which he sounds much cooler than me because of his Scottish or Irish accent. But he basically says like, you have a very particular and specific set of things within your nothing. And it's good because like the law is behind it, so even if it's not like a
But
field
that's what I'm
that
saying,
couldn't exist
is
without
there
matter.
a problem with there being something before the universe? You know?
How did the something get there?
How did those laws
Yeah.
get there? Is kind of
That goes
Like,
to-
why aren't they themselves self-existent like God? You
That
know?
that goes back to the, what's the cause of God? You wind up in an infinite regress. In other words, what's that something? Well, what caused the something?
That's not the question that I'm asking though.
Okay.
Why aren't the laws themselves able to be self-existent?
What's a law without something to affect it?
even if it's not like a tangible physical thing, it's still a thing.
What would cause something that the law is about to spring into existence? 'Cause
the laws themselves.
how can a law cause something to happen?
So laws aren't causal agents. They're secondary causes.
So like if I make a law that orange unicorns are not allowed to drink Pepsi,
Hey.
it does not mean that orange unicorns are suddenly gonna exist with a desire to drink Pepsi. You need someone who wants to make that happen.
That's me.
We're gonna have one. But just because the law is there, it's like you can make meaningless laws all day, but without something to cause the events or objects or whatever the laws are about to exist, they're meaningless. And so, I mean, maybe the laws always existed, you could potentially argue for that, but without a physical thing that they're about, they wouldn't have any good anyway.
So then my question to that is like, how is a God that exists with nothing to exist relative to, how can that, like, doesn't that have the same problem? Like, a being that has nothing to interact with? How's that any different than a law that has nothing to interact with?
I think this argument just shows that there's something that necessarily exists outside of the material and outside of time.
You have to have an uncreated cause that preceded the causal universe.
And also with the fields and stuff, you would still need space and time for like matter to appear in a field. Like a field has to exist within space for it to do anything.
Right.
So it couldn't cause space to come into existence and just be the, I guess, potentially if space did come into existence, maybe the field would be there, but it won't cause space to be
Right,
created.
but Big Bang cosmology says at time zero there was no space, time, energy, matter. There was nothing. They couldn't even have a field.
So the atheistic argument kind of falls short because those laws or whatever that did exist or had to exist, like Lennox says, it's a very specific set of things, right? And they basically don't get out of the problem of something existing beforehand.
Okay.
And yeah, as
I think law is an observation of something going on in the universe, like gravity. You have to have those two items attracting to each other. Then you say there's a law of gravity. But it seems like the material has to exist before you observe a law. Maybe.
curious about that.
Right, last question. For this point.
Moving on.
We can talk more later. Alright, go.
The sixth point that he brings, that somebody brings up, I guess, is nothing ever begins to exist, since the material it is made out of already exists. This is somewhat similar to the previous argument, that it uses the word nothing, but actually means nothing in this sense. But the confusion here is we're getting back to material and efficient causes. The argument does not assume material causes to these things. It assumes efficient causes. And it doesn't actually point to a material cause to things. If anything, it points to an immaterial cause to these things, such as God. But a thing that I would definitely ask this person is if they are a nihilist of some kind, because this is getting very close to metaphysical nihilism, which has its own host of problems, which is the basic idea of nothing ever existed or began to exist. I would say these people are very hard to talk to, and I cannot say that there is a super easy, just two-step approach, three-step approach to approaching these types of questions, because simply with the idea of nihilism, you saying something to them by their own logic doesn't actually exist. And I mean, there's a lot of aspects to it, but I would definitely approach this in asking what their perspective is, because there are a lot of perspectives that can be drawn from the statement alone. So asking their perspective and moving forward with that knowledge, or if you even can move forward with that knowledge, is really important, because the last thing you want to do is assume that somebody believes something that they maybe don't believe, or that they believe something different or adjacent. So especially with this question, approaching with your own question is really important. And if it does end up being that they have some confusion between material or efficient cause, or whatever cause that they believe that the argument is assuming, it would be good to talk about these causes and bring them up so that they can understand what the actual argument is trying to get at. Yes.
Is this not an example of the second fallacy, where the premise assumes the truth of the conclusion?
Oh, equivocation?
Yeah, 'cause isn't the first half of the sentence assuming anything that you would make stuff out of already exists? Kinda seems like
Yes,
it.
I would say yes. But I will say bringing that up to the person might not be
Maybe not help.
unfortunately, but yeah. I'd say yeah. I'd say it's falls into a fallacy of equivocation. But moving on. 7. Kalam equivocates on begins to exist that the phrase means different things in 1 versus 2. This is very similar to some of the arguments that we've seen before, so I'm not gonna spend a crazy amount of time on it, but the general idea is that they believe in the first statement where it says everything that begins to exist has a cause, means to begin from a previous material state, and then the next being but, the second, the universe began to exist, means from an immaterial state. This is, again, another example of confusing material and efficient causes. And William Lane Craig actually brings up I don't know how to put it, I guess just a statement of what is caused. My mind is getting away from myself, but he brings up like the definition that he uses in his argument, which goes as follows: X begins to exist if and only if X exists at some time t, and there is no time t star prior to t at which X exists. That's a lot of t's and x's, it exists. But the general idea is that something that begins to exist has no time prior that it has existed. So if I were the first person ever to invent purple unicorns drinking Pepsi or something, like orange. But maybe I wanna do purple, cause you already came up with orange. But if I were the first person to come up with that, and I made that thing, and there is no time t prior to which that has ever existed, then that thing has come into existence, per se. And he goes forward to explain very in depth in a lot of terms that make zero sense to me about what this means, but in general, it is just he has defined the idea of exists in something that is caused so that it isn't confused in his argument that he is making differences or assuming differences between all of these points. That was a lot of words. Moving on. 8. It is self-contradictory. Kalam claims there is a first uncaused cause. Yes, but no. He claims whatever begins to exist has a cause of its existence. He does not claim that everything has a cause of its existence. He is not assuming that the first uncaused cause that he talks about has some sort of cause to it. Cause he claims that whatever begins to exist has a cause of its existence. This is just simply a misunderstanding of the argument and definitely just bringing up the point that he isn't claiming everything to have a cause, but he is claiming that whatever begins to exist has a cause. Number 9, we're in the final stretch here, guys. The Kalam argument could easily say that the universe comes from nothing as from a cause, just like emptiness or other similar concepts. This is getting at this idea that something can come from nothing, which is absurd and is also completely contradictory to what he's saying in his argument. He is saying that there has to be some sort of cause. To say that nothing has caused something is to say that nothing has caused it, it is uncaused. It wouldn't make sense for me to say that nothing caused the slideshow to move forward, because otherwise nothing would have happened. It wouldn't have happened at all, because it hasn't actually been caused.
Fun fact, I have a button too.
Yes. But to our final point, there is no proof for the Christian God in the Kalam argument. We've already talked on this. It doesn't claim for there to be proof of the Christian God. It is just claiming that there is some sort of uncaused causer that caused the universe to exist. Even further than that, that's his extension of the argument. It simply states that the universe has a cause. It is not supposing anything past that by the pure argument itself. Of course, as mentioned, and as Craig even talked about, it is very easy to move forward and assume a personal creator by some ends, but the argument itself does not provide proof for a Christian God specifically. Like Julia mentioned, it wasn't even made for Christianity. It was made by a Muslim, most likely for his faith, his own faith, not our faith. But regardless, this argument does show some value, because especially within atheistic belief, the idea of the universe not being caused is very common. It is very hard to talk about or to bring up God to somebody who doesn't think that anything in this universe was caused specifically, or outside this universe per se. But the argument is very good for getting you to that point where you can try and convince the person that the universe was caused, and by further steps, bring up the Christian God, bring up the Gospels, bring up the good news. And moving on from that, we have the Bible.
So even though we don't have proof for a Christian God from this argument, we do have a lot of Bible verses and passages that I've included, and more to be found, that talk about how infinite God is and the character that we've talked about so far. So in creation itself, Genesis 1:1. Also, by the way, I'm not going to read all these verses, but I'm going to leave them up so you can take pictures, write down the references. John 1:1-4. It's a very famous passage as well. Again, in the beginning, nothing was made without him. All of Job 38 and 39. It's a very long, poetic passage with God asking Job, were you there when I did this, and that, and this, and this, and this, and this? On and on. And I just like reading it. And Colossians. Always around, everything was created through him. He's before all things and holds things together. Phones, stop being held up. Okay. Eternality is another attribute. So Psalm 139. Where shall I go from your spirit? He's everywhere that we can be. Psalm 102. Again, years and years. We are not, our lifespans are nothing compared to God. And Job 36. And we cannot search the number of his years. and application, because another thing we can take from this as Christians is what do we do about these things of God? So Acts, honestly, read until verse 28 as well. It's a good application. I just didn't want to give you a wall of text. But God gave us everything, including life and breath. 2 Peter. The Lord fulfills his promises towards us, but he thinks of time a little bit differently. We all reach repentance, and that's the purpose of his timeline. And Ecclesiastes. Regardless of how infinite God is, we just need to be joyful and do good and enjoy God. And most of all, love. We need to take love wherever we go in apologetics. That is the point of the Bible. It's God's love for us. His steadfast love endures forever. Is another infinite aspect of his. And that's the thing. I love thinking about all the infiniteness of God in terms of everything we've talked about in this presentation. Psalm 136 is another good one. That's just the one that says over and over, his steadfast love endures forever. It's just really cool to think about those attributes of God in light of the philosophical mumbo jumbo you've been blasted with. So finally, yes, in high school, I wrote a paper about this. I had the whole semester to do it. I started reading in like February, and it was beginning of May before I even understood it. So, and we just had an hour and a half. Luke.
Where do you see the Kalam cosmological argument being most useful in having conversations with people?
I would definitely say, I mentioned it a little bit, but especially with people who have a hard time getting to a creator. So most often it can be atheistic belief, but there's plenty of other belief that can have a hard time reaching that point. But the idea of reaching even just a cause for the universe, that is where this argument takes a very strong foothold. Because, I mean, it is incredibly hard to try and argue for this greater being that has caused the universe and is changing things constantly and has his hand in everything if they don't even believe that things have been caused and like the universe has been caused in the first place.
I would say that if you've, like on this campus, everybody pretty much accepts science. So I think you're going from science through philosophy to theology. Because you have a cause now that what he infers is the personality of at the end, and these are two of his books here. This is the harder to read one, this is the easier to read one. That have the argument in it. And to take it to infer from all this argument the personality and all these is about 10 different attributes. So you can go to a personal cause and not just another physical cause. But I think it's a way of breaking into that person's mind who is caught up in the science.
I wanted to say earlier with the law that orange unicorns can't drink Pepsi, doesn't actually cause orange unicorns to exist. I wanted to say laws are not conscious and they can make a decision.
Good point.
They have no volition or power of themselves.
Yeah.
Because also there could be a law, what if the unicorn drinks Pepsi anyway? The law itself is not going to do anything to the unicorn. Yeah.
But if you drank Coca-Cola, you would.
I just have one comment. Almost exactly 3 years ago, I came to this exact talk from Ben Wilson, who was the president of Rancho Christi at the time. And this was like one of the foundational questions that caused me to become a believer. So think about this when you're, teaching it to people, because it has great power.
A cool story I have from this is when I was taking this class in high school, I actually took it with Cinnamon, many of you know her. She had the same paper to write. And a friend of ours is LDS, and so also writing it through with her was really interesting because we were writing and then we got to talking about a lot of this kind of stuff, and it was almost a starting point because we agreed on the general philosophy of this. But from there we could talk more about other parts of our faith, and not necessarily LDS beliefs would fully align with us, but hers did. And so it's almost even just a starting point if you find yourself there. And so you're not necessarily going to end up in that position a lot, but it's almost a doorway, especially if someone really loves philosophy and just loves talking about it. It just, like your random classes, it can almost just be a doorway.
Well, if they acknowledge the Big Bang, that's the entry I like to take, because then you say, okay, it's like a movie camera of the explosion of the universe. Well, you run the tape back to that singularity. What's behind that? Then you can move to this causal effect, which is a principle in chemistry and or science. And now you've got their attention, and you can move on over to the theological side.
What's LDS?
Latter-day Saints.
Mormon.
Mormons.
Oh.
They don't call themselves Mormons.
Yeah, that's a big problem for them because they don't believe that the universe had a beginning.
And that's why I said for this friend in particular, we didn't get into that, but it was still interesting to see what we had in common through this.
So being LDS, did she agree with the Kalam cosmological argument, or was she so was there a bit of a contradiction there then, in that she
I don't know.
did believe that there was a beginning to the universe, but
I don't know how much she went into her own theology, but our papers were generally pretty similar. Like with our different voices, because anyone who knows Cinnamon knows she's not that much like me, so those were different papers.
That's true.
And so was his friends, but in general, like the same conclusions were drawn between the three of us.
Wait, all three of you were writing on the same subject?
It was, yeah, he gave the same paper and subject to everyone in the class.
I forgot, okay.
And it was before ChatGPT.
Yep. And it was a 15-page paper too.
That's intense for high school.
That's why I started in February.
Well, I would never.
And it was also spring 2020, if that means anything to you.
It's too much time.
Before or after.
That was pre-COVID.
Did COVID start?
It was March.
So like I started
COVID.
we started hearing about COVID on the news. It was weird.
So I went into spring break like 2 weeks before I was supposed to, and then just never went back to school.
What caused the Chinese?
Dr. Craig said that he anticipated the most attacks to go to premise 2, but they actually went to premise 1. And he said that a lot of people just start with, instead of what begins to exist has a cause. So he said, whatever exists has a cause, which would include God.
Right.
So you have to lay it out correctly.
Whatever it begins to exist.
Yes.
We have no more questions for your enjoyment.
Random
Ridiculous
Nice.
stuff.
I had to
Skibbity?
choose just one slide.
That's Skibbity,
so
bro.
I just wanted to give you more.
Thank you.
Alright, well, thank y'all. I'll just stand here and yell at everybody. So,
Sit.
actually, first I do want to say this. So just on the lines of what Cole said, I'm really glad he said that. Is this argument means a lot to me as well, because looking back to freshman year, we would have people come into our dorm room and just like sit like late in the night and we just like talk.
Like very
And-
late,
What is that?
like very late.
Very late, too
Yeah.
late for Cole. But it kind of all began with this argument. Was I can distinctly remember us bringing this up, the friends of ours who are not Christians, and talking through the three premises and seeing where they disagree. And it was from just friendly conversations, but it started with just a question of like, where do you think it all came from? And then just keep prodding and keep asking. And by God's grace, multiple of those friends from freshman year are now walking with the Lord and are Christians. And so you just don't know what God's going to do through these conversations, but they are incredibly valuable to have, as obviously Cole could tell you, and as many of us have seen. So my encouragement is to use it. You know, all this stuff it's not just like I get it. It's like go have those conversations, right? Like invite the people into your dorm or your house or wherever you are. You know, have them, ask them, you know, where did it come from? What do you think? Why? And as you start that, you don't know where it's going to lead, you know, 3 or 4 years later. So be intentional with it. That's my encouragement. Announcements. Next week we are not meeting because it is President's Day. And so do not come here. But then the week after, 2 weeks from now, we are meeting again. And we are going to have Carl presenting on the fine-tuning arguments. So if you know what that is, you should be excited. If you don't know what that is, you should be excited. So definitely be here for that. It's a very, very good one. I think it's a very important one. And so we're super excited for that. We're also going to be whiteboarding on that day. We'll send out a poll as we get closer. The topic is going to be, are we living in a simulation? Yes or no? And it's going to be awesome. We love that question. We did it before. It's super fun. So I'd encourage you to come and talk. If you're like, what on earth are you trying to get at there? We would love to talk to you more about it, and hopefully we might have some resources that would be beneficial for you to look into. But yeah, I think that's everything. Does anybody know what Anchor is this month?
20 something.
Yeah, it's in like a couple weeks. Just keep Anchor in your mind. It's being hosted by Salt Company.
21st.
February 21st, which is next Friday, right? Yeah,
A week
okay.
from-
So put that on your calendar. So a week from this Friday is Anchor. I highly encourage you to be there. It's Salt Company. They're great, and hopefully there'll be a lot of people there since it's Salt Company. So awesome. I'm gonna pray us out, and then you are released. Sound good? Dear Lord, thank you for this day. Thank you for the gift of each person here and being here. Thank you for Devin and Julia and the time they put into this presentation, and that they were so diligent towards it, and that they came here and gave it to us. I pray that we would use these things, Lord. By your grace, I've seen in my life what you can do through conversations, starting with this. I pray that everyone else in this room will see that as well. So we praise you, Lord, for what you have done and what you are yet to do through the people in this room. And in your name we pray. Amen. Okay, last thing, actually I lied, I totally forgot I was gonna say this. Is imagine you just started a new class this next Monday, okay? You pick up a class. And then right away they're like, hey, you've got a couple weeks and you have to prepare an hour-and-a-half presentation for the class on top of all your other classes. You would probably not be super excited. You'd probably feel a little overwhelmed. Well, luckily that's what we did to Devin and Julia. And so I just want to throw like a thank you to them that they're willing to do this. It is not an easy thing to spend a lot of time preparing an hour-and-a-half presentation, and especially an hour-and-a-half presentation on something that you want to be true and right and carefully done. I'm gonna be honest. If I have to present for my geotechnics class, I'm not gonna put nearly as much effort in as if I'm like claiming this is the truth and I need you all to know it, like about God and eternity. So very impressed that you guys are willing to do this among all the rest of the school you have, which is a lot. So just recognize the time and effort it takes from them and how cool it is that they're willing to do this. Alright, that's all. I meant to then pray out so it didn't feel awkward, but feel awkward about my compliments. Goodbye.
So go back one slide. At first, I thought you were saying. Because that's what that is.
Not this coming Wednesday, but it'll probably be Wednesday after. I'll send a text out before we do.
That's Julia Roberts.
Yes, the Wednesday
I
after.
thought that's who they were talking about.
That's why I'm at Lions.
If you suddenly started acting normal, you just tried to
I didn't mean to ditch you.
It's okay.
I don't know. You didn't say anything.
Revealed truth. That's
Exactly.
what
Presupposing a set shot.
So this idea
How's your week been?
Pretty good, pretty good.
Anything